Well, thanks everyone for coming. This is a talk by Howard Husock. Sorry, how do you pronounce your last name?
Husock.
Husock. This is a book talk by Howard Husock. He is a senior fellow in domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He focuses on municipal government, urban housing policy, civil society, and philanthropy. And he was previously vice president at the Manhattan Institute. He's also worked at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's a member of he's been a member of the board of directors of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, as well as a journalist and Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker. He's been published in a lot of the most prestigious publications in the country and has several previous books. His latest book is called The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It. I thought it was very interesting. It is actually a pretty quick read. If anyone wants to purchase it, I will post a link in the chat that has a discount on top of what Amazon has, so it's a little cheaper. And I think, so we mentioned this before, but if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and I will ask them at the appropriate time. So first, I think Howard's going to talk a little bit about the book, and he's going to deliver some prepared remarks and give an intro to anyone who, I'm sure everyone's already read the book, but for anyone who might not have. And then I'm going to ask some questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience questions. So Howard, why don't you kick it off?
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for noticing the book. And thanks to everybody on this call for being involved in public affairs in the Bay Area. I think it's wonderful. I think it's great that there is such a group as YIMBY. And I don't even care if I agree with everything that you believe in or not, although I think I do agree with a lot of the things you believe in. But just to see people involved in Bay Area politics, it's really great. So let me begin this talk which is about the history and future of housing policy, with a discussion of one of the more obscure side effects of the fall of the Roman Empire. I do think there's a connection. The Romans, of course, were brilliant engineers and city builders, and they invented many things for which the formulas were later lost. Among the most famous examples is that of the recipe for Roman cement, which stands the test of time better than our current version, for which the recipe has never been fully rediscovered. It could survive water damage, particularly water exposure. So this slightly tortured comparison sets up what I hope will be a relevant discussion of what's known today as affordable housing, filling the need for which seems to perplex cities across the country. Well, there was a time, a la the Romans, that we had a formula for affordable housing, and it did not involve federal or state programs. Not that I'm opposed to all federal or state programs, I'm not. It may sound cold to discuss the need for a poor side of town, as in my book title, but we want to know how to build these and in the process provide homes for millions of Americans at a cost they could afford. Thus, they were affordable. In Boston, where my observation of my immediate built environment really inspired me to think about these issues, there were some 21,000 three-family houses that provided homes for more than 60,000 households. In Philadelphia, between 1870 and 1920, a staggering 299,000 small row homes were built. Chicago had its thousands of two-flats. In 1940, it had 382,000 housing units in 2, 3, and 4 unit homes, more than all its single-family dwellings. Oakland, yes, California, had bungalows, more than 12,000 built in just 3 years between 1921 and 1924. And an early federal study of the housing market in major East Coast cities found that families were generally paying, low-income families, paying no more than 20% of their income in housing costs. We'd love to see that kind of figure today. So what was the secret formula? It's surprisingly simple and based on the following approach: relatively small houses built on relatively small lots. This approach was not only the norm in cities big and small, but even in well-off suburbs, so often characterized what we call today exclusionary zoning. Columbia University's Kenneth Jackson, considering the premier historian of American urbanization, has written, unlike post-World War II suburbs, which are relatively homogeneous socioeconomically, see Marin County, California, earlier suburbs were not restricted to a single economic class. There was diversity behind the posh mainline stereotype. Even the richest communities were dotted with small dwellings whose residents furnished the support for groupings of large mansions. Today, similar neighborhoods, including newer versions, could be starter homes for our children, for your generation, convenient homes for teachers, police, and firefighters, and protection, and this is very important to me, against the insularity of social class insularity of communities. So I'm not interested only in how do we provide housing that can be afforded, but how do we create communities in which we have a shared polity of the social classes. This is an approach, however, that we've not only forgotten, we have effectively banned it. The ownership, agency, and wealth accumulation that comes with owning even a small home on a small lot has been swept away, for instance, by public housing, where private asset ownership is a contradiction in terms. Indeed, since the late 19th century, we've been embarked on efforts to reform, regulate, and replace the private housing market. And in doing so, we have, in the name of helping those of modest means, made obtaining affordable housing and building household wealth, especially, I want to emphasize that, more difficult for them. The premise of my book, that the time is right to take steps to rectify that situation, in part by rediscovering that lost poor side of town, small homes and small lots that owners of modest means can afford and can serve a great many municipalities well. So in the book, I use census data and a number of historic federal housing studies to support the argument. But it's primarily an historical narrative which follows influential individuals central to the rise of housing reform movements. I like to call my book Housing Unreformed, and the complications and indeed, in my opinion, tragedies which they've engendered. Excuse me. So I'll share some of the key elements before turning to discussing some of your own housing situation in California, which I've tried to bone up on slightly. So I'll begin with a personal story of my service as an extremely minor elected official in the town meeting of a New England municipality, that of Brookline, Massachusetts, where I lived for almost 40 years. This was not the open town meeting that you may know from Norman Rockwell, but a municipal legislature representing a town of nearly 60,000 people divided into 16 precincts. One of its attributes was that most got my attention was that you had an incredible economic diversity in this political body. Doctors and lawyers served alongside custodians and public works laborers. I came to realize that that diversity, which embodied political diversity too, was the result of a diversity of neighborhoods and housing types. There was a poor side of this rich town, whose 3-family frame homes contrasted with nearby mansions. I came to learn, however, that the poor side had once been much larger, before urban renewal took 200 such homes, along with small stores and businesses, and replaced them with a luxury high-rise and public housing. The area once known as the Farm had cold water flats, but it was also had a high degree, and this is a key term that I'm trying to introduce in this book, owner presence. The 121 homes in the Farm had 348 units. That means you had lots of housing in which the landlord was living with the tenants, family members, extended family members. They included not only rental units, but owners and tenants on the same premises. And this was not uncommon in the so-called slums of great American cities. Indeed, there's a good case to be made that so-called slums were a market-based response to the provision of affordable housing, that having a poor side of town helped forge a civic polity across class lines and provided a means of asset building among the poor, including the minority poor, and helped ensure higher quality public goods for those of modest means. So that got me to this central question of the book. Why did we undertake a widespread effort to demolish these communities and take legal steps to ensure that neighborhoods with similar sorts of housing diversity would not be built? It's a question I try to answer through an intellectual history tied to a series of key figures. I start with Jacob Riis, probably, maybe, I don't know what is taught in school anymore, so I'll assume that you may have heard of him, but he was a brilliant polemicist and an especially brilliant photographer who, before becoming a housing muckraker, and this is key, was New York City's leading tabloid police reporter. He was, in other words, trained as a sensationalist, and his approach to housing was aimed at finding situations and images especially that shocked. His classic book, How the Other Half Lived, is still widely taken as a serious study of housing conditions, but there's every reason to believe that it exaggerated the plight of the late 19th century poor. A recent biography of the Danish-born Riis by a contemporary Danish-born writer, Tom Buk-Swienty, classed Riis among, quote, reporters and writers who wrote about the slums focused primarily on suffering and squalor. But in a biting critique of what I like to call the reformer's gaze, how the middle class sees the poor, this new biography was clear-eyed about Riis's limitation. There was more to the slums than abject poverty. Hundreds of thousands of families lived normal lives. They worked, they paid rent, they fed their children, they had hopes and dreams, and for a large number of immigrants, it was an improvement on their old lives, offering a dignified existence. And crucially, it was not a life sentence, as many writers wanted their readers to believe. Many went up and out of the slums. According to an 1894 report by the US Commissioner of Labor, yes, they were doing those reports that long ago, overcrowding and health problems were actually relatively rare in the poor districts of Baltimore and Philadelphia, in a slum district in Chicago. And again, there was a high degree of owner presence in small multifamily areas. I'm particularly interested in African-American Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and Cleveland, where there were places like Bronzeville in Chicago, known as the Black Metropolis, where owner presence and Black-owned businesses were common before its clearance to make way for some of the nation's most infamous public housing projects, such as the Robert Taylor homes. But Jacob Riis had set off a housing reform stampede, one with whose effects we continue to live today. First, it strongly reinforced an earlier idea that housing built without profit should be the chief goal for providing healthy housing. From this idea, the idea of public housing germinated, as championed by two women, Edith Abbott Wood of Columbia University, and especially Catherine Bauer, the author of a crucial 1936 book entitled Modern Housing. Both believed that the private housing market would, by its nature, fail to provide for the needs of the majority of the population. Both would join the Roosevelt administration, and indeed Bauer would go on to write the National Housing Act of 1937, which is still the seminal housing public policy, which has been amended many times, but it's still the core act. As amended in 1948, it would become the vehicle not for upgrading so-called slums, but for slum clearance. Neighborhoods replete with small landlords taking in lodgers, single room occupancy, quote unquote hotels, small shops and community institutions were swept away and replaced by public housing, where asset ownership was a contradiction in terms. A notable example, which got Jeremy's attention because he was born in the Detroit area, which I cite, is the clearance of an iconic African-American neighborhood in Detroit known as Black Bottom. It was named for the soil, not that the French discovered there, not because it became a minority neighborhood. It was home to more than 300 Black-owned businesses, an active urban league to help new Southern transplants, and prominent churches, including the new Bethel Zion Church, where the minister was Aretha Franklin's father, the Reverend C.L. Franklin. Black Detroit residents today continue to celebrate the neighborhood and mourn its loss. The project was rightly derided, including by Aretha Franklin herself in her song, Why I Sing the Blues, as quote unquote, Negro removal. I was just on a Detroit Public Library event last week to talk about it, and there was tremendous interest, and there's still a black bottom archive community site. The memory of it lives in Detroit. If slum clearance and public housing were one part of the Riis legacy, the other was so-called housing betterment, led by one Lawrence Veillet, a friend of Riis who sought to give lasting form to his work through the National Better Housing Association. He began and his nationwide group with a push for modest housing codes, such as New York's new law tenements to provide better ventilation. But then he went on to become what I call the Johnny Appleseed of zoning codes. By comparison with the strictures of contemporary land use regulation, Veillet's group, which worked across the United States to convince municipalities successfully to adopt zoning laws, they had relatively modest vision. Keep the multifamily apartments on the main streets, keep the single families on the side streets, separate commercial and residential. But over time, the combination of this public housing ideal and zoning became a formula deadly for the housing diversity which a population of varying household incomes needs, what I call a ladder of housing types. Public housing proved in large part such a dramatic and tragic failure. Systems in which no household can build assets and maintenance declined to the point where demolition of these slum replacements became widespread. Keep in mind that the famous implosion of the Pruitt-Aggo housing project in St. Louis in 1971 occurred only 17 years after it was built and won architectural awards for architect Yamasaki, who also designed the World Trade Center in New York. How star-crossed is this? At the same time, that failure has not deterred housing reformers, but only reinforced the view that there must be some public housing variation that will ensure safe, sanitary, and affordable housing secured through public funding. Rather than rediscovering the key attribute of what I call naturally occurring affordable housing, as in the slums of old and their progeny, the reform march has ignored the possibility that a range of modestly sized multifamily homes at relatively high density can do the job. In my view, the long shadow of public housing has had ongoing deleterious effects, playing a role in convincing newer post-war suburbs that the best quality of life is attained only through a single-family zoning. This was Lawrence Veillet's idea taken to an extreme, yet it characterizes large numbers of municipalities. Just go to San Jose and see for yourself, and many other places in California, obviously. Crucially, zoning, as it has affected residential development, has come to be virtually synonymous with single-family zoning. And looking back on almost a century of the effects of residential zoning in the US, Robert Ellickson of Yale Law School describes what he calls a zoning straitjacket, the freezing of American neighborhoods as single-family homes. Once a single-family home, forever a single-family home. He analyzed 37 suburbs in California, Connecticut, and Texas, and found that municipalities had set aside 91% of the residentially zoned land exclusively for detached homes. Such zoning by its nature is a barrier to the development of lower cost, lower income portions of town, and it acts as a straitjacket, as he puts it. By the way, public housing, once built, also becomes what I call the frozen city. There may be great industries that want to start off in some public housing site, but no, it can only be used for public housing. So it is that we face difficult current questions as a result of this inheritance of housing reform. We search for ways to ensure housing for those of modest means, but preclude its construction. We still have millions living in dysfunctional public housing. 3 million public housing units continue to exist. In response, we have overlooked the lessons of pre-public housing, pre-urban renewal, pre-zoning, diversity of housing, and dispersed ownership. Well, how then can we break our housing and zoning deadlock? In my view, we must look to shared interests and persuasion, not to subsidies and pressure. The idea that we face a housing missing middle has begun to take hold. Like Lawrence Veillet a century ago, we must seek to convince our municipalities, our planning boards by planning board, that somewhat dense, 2 to 4 unit housing can provide opportunity for millennials hoping to stay in their own hometowns, or for teachers and firefighters who'd like to live where they work. It's worth noting that the quintessential post-World War II single-family zoning, Long Island's Levittown, featured homes of 750 square feet. In their own way, even they were a poor side of town. They had to get special permission to build homes without basements and to use slab construction. We're beginning to see the dam break a little bit, and you guys are on the cutting edge of that. Accessory dwelling units are increasingly being permitted in Massachusetts and California. There have been about 30,000 ADUs in California authorized since 2012. Of course, the state has a shortfall of 1.5 million housing units. So, well, that speaks for itself. I happen to think Airbnb can be understood as a new version of taking in lodgers, which is a time-honored route to affordability. The recent passage of SB 9 to permit duplex homes on single-family sites is important. It deserves 3 cheers for symbolism and 1.5 to 2 for its practical impact, in my opinion. The details set limits, I'm told by attorneys who specialize in zoning law. Outright demolition and replacement of a single-family home may not pencil out in affluent areas. The most likely lots to be affected will be deep and skinny, so-called shotgun lots that may permit 2 duplex units, 4 units in all, 1 in front and 1 in back of the lot. Elderly homeowners will have an incentive to enter into such deals because they'll be incentivized to stay in their homes for up to 3 years. But I'm sure you guys know this already, but I'll state it. The law also calls for, quote, no adverse effects on the physical environment, an invitation to abutting owners in higher income areas to litigate on environmental grounds. And homes must be at least 800 square feet. That's larger than those in the original Levittown. All this means that we may see some duplex construction on skinny lots in lower income neighborhoods. Think here of Compton and Inglewood, if you know LA. Not a bad thing, although some will worry about gentrification. I'm not really in that category. Less onerous parking requirements will also help spur construction. So like I said, 1.5 to 2 stars. I'm less enthusiastic about SB 10, which, as you know, permits voluntary local upzoning in transit zones and exempts developments from CEQA. High-density rental units, even if subsidized for those of lower incomes, simply don't provide the vehicles for wealth accumulation and shared community that does a freestanding poor side of town. Here's an interesting wild card. Maybe you know all about this too, so forgive me if I'm boring you. Assembly Bill 721, sponsored by Assembly Member Richard Bloom of Santa Monica. Although nominally about striking down vestiges of race-related deed restrictions, the bill also stipulates that density restrictions and private covenants cannot be used to curtail affordable and supportive housing. This could actually mean that owners of properties in business parks or strip malls will have the right to convert to subsidized housing, even if covenants restricting uses in these developments are extant and have nothing to do with race and are currently quite legal and standard. Expect legal chaos as business park owners with vacant buildings become alive to this possibility. But it's really interesting. I'd like to see it without a requirement for 100% subsidized affordable. That's California, though. These incremental and complex zoning changes will not, moreover, substitute for greenfield development replete with a variety of small multifamily, naturally occurring affordable housing types, which create communities of shared social and economic station. I'm in favor of that rather than viewing that as unfortunate economic stratification. And of course, construction in California will not be inexpensive for a wide variety of means, whether de facto union labor requirements or solar panel mandates. And there's the collateral damage of Prop 13 in encouraging homeowners to stay put, even if they no longer need the large home that they're living in. But here's what to look out for. Senator Cory Booker and Congressman James Clyburn have filed a bill they call the Home Act, which could tie the new wave of federal infrastructure funds to communities to a requirement to change their so-called exclusionary zoning laws. Washington's interpretation of compliance, however, can be very expansive and bureaucratic. And during the Obama years, HUD turned down 63% of so-called affirmatively furthering fair housing applications tied to federal funds, often for reasons only marginally related to discrimination. They could include, for instance, distance from grocery stores and not being in high opportunity zip codes. We need to do this at the local level. We don't want the federal government being involved in zoning decisions in planning boards around the country. I do agree with Senator Booker, though, that duplex and triplexes are the way to go. I prefer to celebrate here the approach of the formula that we've lost, what was celebrated in a classic early sociology text written by two settlement house pioneers in early 20th century immigrant Boston. Robert Woods and Albert Kennedy of the South End Settlement House celebrated what they called the zone of emergence. Their studies of the city's housing market found that nearly 60% of the small dwellings and three-family tenements are in the hands of one-time immigrant families in relatively humble circumstances. Those are the people today with whom my heart is attached. Woods and Kennedy continued. Over 65% of the residential property of the zone of emergence is owned by those who reside in it. And this is the best possible index that can be given of the end that holds the imagination and galvanizes the power of a large portion of the population. This was 1915. It is an index they wrote of striving and accomplishment. We need to have such an index today and encourage just those qualities. Thanks very much. Ask me anything you want at all.
Awesome. Thanks, Howard. And that was a very useful. It was a great intro. I think it covered a lot of the more sort of drawing out the book themes questions. So maybe I'll start in with some more trying to push a little. So you mentioned this, and in the book you also talk about kind of trying to do this change on the local level, right?
Yeah.
Rather than federal top-down mandates. You're trying to convince homeowners that really upzoning is good for everyone. It's good for the neighborhood. In the YIMBY movement, we've definitely tried a lot of that, right? We've tried a lot of convincing both in bigger cities as well as suburbs that we would kind of consider typically pretty exclusionary, lots of single family zoning, and haven't had a lot of success. I mean, we've had more, I would say, success on the broader base sort of state level, deregulatory things like SB 9, SB 10. Do you think that, federally, I think is one thing I personally mostly agree that I think the federal government is a way too big of a hammer to sort of handle urban zoning. But do you think in states like California, where there are very small municipalities that are essentially totally controlled by the existing homeowners, do you think that there's sort of a role for the state to kind of break up that cartel?
That seems like appropriate. As I said, with my 1.5 cheers for SB 9, I think it only gets you so far. But I think it's a positive. I only mentioned Prop 13 in passing, but it's a particular handicap that you have.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why free market conservatives think it's a good idea, because it inhibits turnover, and you need natural turnover in order to give a young man a chance, as they used to say, and a young woman a chance. So it's very unfortunate. I'm very mindful, though, of what William Levitt and Sons did in Levittown. They went to the town planning board and they packed the hearing. They had this plan. It had been turned down once. And they packed the hearing room with 700 returning World War II veterans. and they all told their stories, and they pressured that planning board. So now, to the extent that YIMBYites like you can be married to actual developers and actual projects, I don't know, does that become more imaginable?
We have done a lot of project by project advocacy, and it's quite frustrating. Unfortunately, I think that there are some homeowners that are just sort of small c conservative. Like, even if upzoning would actually yield them a profit, they just sort of don't like change. And I think if there was a larger jurisdiction, this would be different, right? Because I think the problem, at least one of the big problems in my opinion, is in California we have such hyper local jurisdictions where you're literally like, if I drive from my house down to like Google, I'll pass through like, you know, 15, 20 municipalities within like a 45-minute drive. And so, there's no one who speaking for people who are not currently living there, who are potential future residents. I think that's really the challenge. And that's something YIMBY has tried to do, right? We try to sort of say we're the voices for the future people who would live in this project, but are not currently living there. I also think there's a problem, right, where, and this is the political discourse problem that is certainly true in cities like San Francisco and broadly, within urban environments in California, when people propose, projects, because they're new construction, they're only, in the end, the people who can afford to live there are not World War II, not recently, returned World War II veterans who are modest. It's people like me who work in tech. And I mean, I am less rich than like a 60-year-old homeowner who lives in San Francisco, but like, I'm not as politically sympathetic, right? I think, no one thinks of people who work in tech and just want to have an affordable place as being terribly sympathetic, especially in a very polarized, hyper left environment like San Francisco, where it's just very polarized.
Yeah, no, I feel your pain, and there's no simple formula. And so in that context, SB 9, SB 10, and this, had you heard of this obscure assembly bill?
I had heard of it, yes.
Yeah, I think
I didn't, but I hadn't heard of all the. I mean, what you were talking about with like with those opportunities. I did not hear. I didn't know. I don't know if anyone's really talked about that. At least I haven't heard about it.
Apparently, he tacked that on to this thing that these UCLA students were trying to do to get rid of all these old racial covenants. I intend to ask him about it, but no, I feel your pain, and I think those are important but modest steps. But at the same time, one of the advantages of having so many small local communities is there might be one that you can pick off. Maybe it's more possible in Redwood City than it is in Palo Alto,
Right. No, that's definitely true. And I think we have had more success in some places than others. I mean, there are some very bad actors and some people that are actually, trying to be helpful. Unfortunately, right, the problem is that housing is a regional economy, right? So it's not like, you have a beggar thy neighbor type situation where it's like, it's really of everyone's, it's good for everyone on some level that we add population and add opportunities and add jobs in the whole area, but it's not necessarily good in the specific interest of every municipality to add housing literally there, right? It's sort of a collective action problem.
It is a collective action problem. I'm fascinated. I'm not really a futurist, but I'm thinking about what's going to happen with, self-driving cars, the lack of need for parking, with, the decline of retail, work from home, work from another region, business parks, and everything ordered online. I'm just wondering whether there's going to be massive opportunity with business parks and strip malls to be converted to housing uses. And so we might be just looking at a whole different target, and they'll still require zoning change, but their owners are going to be desperate for something.
Yeah, we did actually have a bill that was for housing in commercial zones that I think died either last year or the year before. I think labor killed it. They kill a lot of bills because they try to insert like everyone has to be a union member construction requirements, which just make which make the projects just not pencil out, and so nothing ends up getting built. So one thing I really found interesting when reading your book, talking about the historical sort of, I would say, like, poverty of ownership, right? People are poor, but they still own something.
Yes.
And I've gone through the mortgage process after 2008 a couple times. And the thing that really impressed me when I was reading all that stuff is, like, I just can't really imagine someone who is of modest means qualifying for a loan. Like, anyone who doesn't have like a regular salary job, even if they're rich, right? Even people who are independent contractors who have a long history of making enough money, even they often have trouble qualifying for loans. Do you think that, like, I actually don't know, were things different back then, or are there policies? Like, is it a regulatory thing? Like, are there things we can do to make ownership easier for people?
I think they're very different. First, before the Federal Housing Administration in the New Deal, there were no 30-year mortgages. So people of modest means were saving cash and making deals, but the houses were cheap and they had rental income. So that would be something I think is very important for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which buy the majority of mortgages in this country, to count potential rental income as part of the income of the potential home buyer. So that would help more people qualify, looking beyond your own wages or gross adjusted income.
Yeah.
I think that would help.
I totally agree. And it's actually funny because I have like a very relevant story to this. When I recently bought a place in Tahoe, and my plan was to move to Tahoe and rent out my current place, this one. And when I was trying to qualify, they were like, well, you can only use the income if you have a lease already. So you need to show that you have a lease already signed. And I'm like, well, I can't have a lease already signed because I currently live here. I got to move first. But like, I can give you all my neighbors who are renting out their places and they're identical to mine. And it was just like, nope, we need a year. We need like a signed lease. And it was just like a very frustrating chicken and egg situation where it's like, I would have for sure been able to rent this place. And it's just like, that's not the rules.
You have what the economists call imputed rent.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah, the chat just posted count Airbnb income. I'm all for that. I'm for expansively defined credit scores as long as they're not crazy, as long as you're not counting, I don't know, just something that is fanciful. So for instance, Habitat for Humanity, I'm a big fan of Habitat for Humanity because they build these modest trailer-like houses all over places where there's cheap land. And they look at people's records of making payments, and they look at whether they show up to help build other people's houses and count that as evidence that they're reliable people. Well, that's pretty interesting.
That is really interesting. I like
sweat
that
equity,
idea.
so-called.
Yeah, absolutely. So continuing on the ownership sort of theme, I think a lot of YIMBYs are a little wary about the sort of wealth building aspect of ownership, of home ownership, because in the end, the price you sell is the price at which someone else is buying. So a society where homes are continuing to appreciate above inflation, is a society where the next generation is like just going to have a harder time finding housing than the prior one every single time. How do you respond to sort of that critique?
Well, that's a zero-sum view of the world, isn't it? So for instance, it's quite possible that home values, in fact, it's occurring in Austin, Nashville, and Salt Lake City, are going to go up because those economies are becoming more dynamic. And the return to the investment for homeowners is the result of that dynamism, not as some sort of parasitism. So I think we should hope that real estate appreciates because you're in a dynamic growth economy.
But if it but I mean, if real estate is appreciating, like if all real estate in a particular metro area is uh is is increasing like at a rate that's above inflation, doesn't that sort of just mean that like someone who, I mean, like obviously if there's new housing being built that's less expensive, then that's one thing. But if a lot of what we think is sort of the reason why home values are going up so much higher than inflation is that there's not that much housing being built, and if we built more housing, it would be more stable. Not necessarily like losing value, but also not being the world's best investment.
Well, I think you don't want to infer perpetual reality from a snapshot of California at present. I think what you're describing is highly accurate as for what's been going on in California. But, I think we're seeing a bounce back from the West Coast to places where housing is less expensive, and the work from home situation is gonna amplify that. So, that where I grew up in Cleveland, literally my only friend that I knew when I was a kid who's still in Cleveland, which has lost vast amounts of population, just had a large home across the street from him purchased by a couple from the Bay Area who are going to work from home, and they were able to get, could easily be a 4,000 square foot home for like $300,000.
Oh, that's crazy. So another critique I think that some YIMBYs give about homeownership is that homeowners actually are often the biggest drivers of the kinds of exclusionary zoning that your book really critiques. And in your own book, you actually include an interesting story about a Black homeowner who doesn't want more rental housing because he thinks it's going to make the neighborhood more Black.
He doesn't want subsidized. He doesn't want subsidized.
So this is the interesting thing is like as probably everyone on this call can tell you, homeowners, they aren't just against subsidized housing. I mean, they, at least in everything and I've experienced, they're against all new housing. And in fact, actually, many people who are against building new market rate housing give as their reason for opposing it that it's not subsidized enough, right? That this is just market rate housing. It's not affordable housing, so it's only going to be used by tech and the rich. And I think some of those people are clearly bad faith, right? They just don't want anything, and they're going to pick up whatever excuse they need. But I do believe that some of them are genuine, right? I know for a fact that some of them are genuinely do just believe that we should only build new housing that's affordable. I guess, do you think, is that an inherent part of homeownership? Like, is there a way to make homeownership less inherently NIMBY the way it is, at least the way it is here?
The property tax situation in California is so unusual. Taxes are capped, and you rely on redistribution from the state level for what should be basic community provided public goods. So typically there's a positive feedback loop of some kind at the local level, because more development, it imposes some service costs, but it may also generate more revenue, and it doesn't always come out as a negative. Many times it doesn't. Certainly with commercial development, it doesn't. But that feedback loop is broken in California because your property tax revenue is capped. So I come back to Prop 13 as a particular problem, but it also directs me to think that the breakthrough in California will have to come through greenfield development, so that you're not building in people's backyards. Literally, I think it's like, even in San Jose, I did a paper on San Jose for the Manhattan Institute. There's a lot of, undeveloped area in San Jose. And
there is. Yeah, there is. And I think some of the, I think there's a place for sort of trying to not just sprawl out completely into the wilderness, but I also think that leaving, we have land that's like a mile from a transit stop that's literally like zoned as agriculture. Like, that's really stupid. Like we having this high productivity land that can only be used for agriculture, which is a relatively low productivity use in one of the most valuable urban markets in the country, I think is just mind-numbingly stupid.
Yeah, and so I think, this is a political matter, and you guys understand that. but you need a combination of people who will benefit, like yourselves or your peers. You need developers. You probably need labor. You know, you need people to steamroller these local planning boards. And that's not going to happen as lovely as SB9 is. And I really do like it. One or two duplexes at a time. It's going to have to be whole business parks that get converted to, ideally, in my opinion, a new neighborhood of two-family houses with stores, like real places, real new neighborhoods, as opposed to, housing developments.
Yeah. Well, one way we try to solve, and I think really, right, I'm sure that you're, and probably many, if not most of us on this call are critical of programs like inclusionary zoning, which requires that new developments all have a percentage of them being left for subsidized housing or those who make lower than median income. I also sort of see that as solving sort of a political problem, right? Which is not a real market problem, but a political problem where, because of cities like San Francisco and the Bay Area, where we've dug ourselves into a hole for decades, any new housing is, anyone who's middle class or poor are going to look at that housing being built and they're going to say, oh, this isn't for me. And they don't of course see the filtering effects that really it makes all housing affordable for everyone, at some point. Do you think, and sort of it makes it easier to sell development to the voters when they say, okay, well, we know that the brand new housing is not going to be for you, but we're going to make sure we're going to give you 20% of the units in this new building, to solve that political problem. Do you think this is, yeah, go ahead.
Tempting, on the other hand, you are chasing your tail because it pushes up the prices of the remainder of the units. So, and a housing market in which one relies on hitting the lottery and getting one of these affordable units, by the way, whose appreciation is capped and there's permanent affordability. I'm so opposed to permanent affordability. Let people make a living here, let people of modest means acquire wealth through wealth accumulation, like people in Marin County. But I don't think that's a natural community. I think it's a weird community. I say in the book that you're being led in through the poor door, and do you really want to be the poor people in a rich development? The fact of the matter is, and this is really politically incorrect to say, people group themselves by socioeconomic status, and they have a comfort level based on socioeconomic status. And it used to be that poor communities really were eager to play that football game against the rich community and kick their butts. Well, that's okay. That's okay. The idea that you're going to be living here in my upscale apartment building at my sufferance, I think is patronizing and weird.
Yeah, and it's social engineering. I mean, it's the classic kind of social engineering that I think most people on the center right would be generally opposed to. I mean, that's very fair.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to it on ideological grounds, though I am. I'm just opposed to it because I think it's weird. I think it's a weird status to be in, a weird life to be asked to live.
So I'm going to ask a question from the chat that kind of was
a lot of good ones.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask Ramon, is it fair to say that the value of land can continue increasing while the value of the housing units themselves decrease, for example, due to increasing density as the area becomes more dynamic?
Whoa. Say that again.
So is it fair to say that the value of land will continue to increase, in a place where investment's coming in, like we're talking about, while the value of the actual housing units are decreasing? So I think it's basically making a distinction between the value of the house and the value of the land, right? Because in houses themselves don't really appreciate. It's really the land that they're on.
There's no doubt about that. I mean, that's Henry Georgism 101, but there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, if you have a San Jose single family house In Buffalo, it's worth $40,000.
Right. So I want to move on to some of the critiques of public housing and subsidized housing. I think a lot of YIMBYs would probably argue that the reason that a lot of the public housing is in such a sad state is that really it's just the sort of racism, because we had those kinds of projects. They were fine when there were white people living there. Once there were minorities living there, they were disinvested, and hence the issues. How would you respond to that critique?
Well, I respond to that by saying the public housing model itself is fundamentally flawed. People are not really aware of the fact that the public housing model was based on the idea that government would subsidize construction through the United States Housing Authority, which gave bonding authority to local housing authorities, 3,000 of them across the country, but that it was expected that rents from the residents were going to pay the upkeep. It was a nonprofit housing model. Instead, what happened is that as maintenance needs grew, those with housing options left the projects. And remember, those projects in Detroit that I talked about, they were originally for Black people. They were bright, shining new when Diana Ross of the Supremes moved in to the Frederick Douglass houses, So it's not like they were invested in for African American people, but the model was broken. The maintenance needs were too great over time, and as poorer and poorer people lived there wasn't a revenue stream to keep them up. It was never expected that the government was going to have to keep investing. It was going to be a nonprofit model of tenant investment. And then, crucially, and not many people know this, in 1968, Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, the first Black Republican first Black senator elected after Reconstruction, a Republican left over from the Party of Lincoln days, passed the so-called Brooke Amendment to the National Housing Act, which capped rents for public housing tenants and subsidized tenants. So if you have a housing voucher today, it's still true, at 30% of income. That was a way to guarantee that revenue to housing authorities declined. That was the disinvestment, if you will, but it was offered on behalf of buffering tenants from increasing rents due to the fact that maintenance charges were increasing. So to sum up, it's the model of public housing, not some animus toward public housing residents.
Do you think that there's any role for sort of subsidized housing, like for people who have, maybe serious mental illnesses or disabilities who need, permanent sort of supportive care? Do you think it's better to have them be housed in something, even if built by the government, versus sort of what it's like now, where they're on the street in San Francisco outside my house?
Oh, and that's a whole different thing. First of all, I'm agnostic. In terms of elderly housing, the elderly poor, I'm agnostic about whether the government should build and operate those housing, or it should pay Marriott to build that. I'm agnostic about that. See what works. But I do think that even traditional public housing can be a way station. We've got a lot of it. We've got 1 million units. We got to do something good with it since we have it. And I think we can use it as a way station for people, but I think it should be regarded as a short-term transitional housing model, so that as you enter public housing, you say, okay, we're going to give you 5 years. You're not going to pay 30% of your income in rent, because that means your rent will go up as your income goes up. We're going to have you pay rent like people in private markets, so you could save money. And this low rent for that period of time will allow you to move up and out. The San Bernardino Housing Authority in California does this. It's one of about a small handful of housing authorities in the country that have gotten permission to have a time limit. They've been very successful with it, and they'll tell you all about it. There's some really sharp people who run that housing authority in the largest county in California. Now, as far as versus on the street and homeless, that's a whole other category. I'm doing an event at AEI on Thursday about that, whether and this is what I believe, we need much more of a treatment model for this population, that housing is the apparent problem, but often not the underlying problem.
Another thing that I think, really astutely point out is that public housing bans businesses, and it's sort of a commerce-free zone. Do you see kind of a parallel to that in a lot of the bans that are on home-based businesses today, like hairstylists and a lot of these businesses that are subject to onerous licensing restrictions, or they can't be in neighborhoods, and that they often sort of have a disproportionate effect on minorities and people who are lower income.
Well, I mean, it's a slightly parallel subject, but yeah, I certainly agree that occupational licensing barriers, and the Obama administration did a big study on this. So there's a bipartisan sense that incumbents, Ed Glaeser and David Cutler at Harvard have a new book about cities, and they use the term incumbents. It's a very good term. And Prop 13 homeowners, they're incumbents. We're talking about an incumbency problem and the barriers that it poses, but professional incumbents, they're a problem. They have to be pushed, but I actually see the lack of businesses in public housing as more parallel to residential only zoning, which have created, there's a tremendous upsurge in desire for walkability now. Well, guess what? We created all these communities where you can't walk anywhere. And that was by design. Why did we do that? So the designers of public housing, like Robert Moses and others, they thought they were, and Le Corbusier, the ultimate, they thought they were creating the city of the future by separating residential and commercial, but they created, dead zones, as Jane Jacobs pointed out, kind of a prophet without honor.
Makes sense. So you do recognize that on some level there does need to be some social safety net if people can't provide for themselves, hopefully temporarily. You criticize Section 8, which is, I hadn't really thought about it like this, but you criticize it in part because it basically has a very specific point of view on how many people should live in a house, so people can't choose to voluntarily overcrowd themselves in order to save money to maybe go and move to another situation. And I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. It makes total sense to me. Is there a way that we could reform Section 8 to eliminate some of those pitfalls? Is it just having fewer restrictions in the cash transfer, or are there other ways that we can actually make those programs more of a hand up and not a handout?
If we're going to have a housing voucher, I would time limit it, and I would not require people to pay 30% of their income in rent, because that creates a huge marginal tax rate. It's crazy. It's the highest marginal tax rate going for the poorest people. You earn another dollar, you pay 30 cents more in rent. Why? We're not doing them a favor. But I mean, more broadly, in much broader political terms, I don't know why we want to give a housing stamp as opposed to general cash transfer and allow people to make the best use of that redistributed money. That seems to make more sense to me. But that would extend to food stamps. That would extend to a lot of things. That's Charles Murray land. I'm not sure we're going there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think in the end, fewer restrictions allow people to have that autonomy and control of their own life. So, I think one of the biggest, criticisms that I've heard, in response to your ideas are really about, mixed income neighborhoods. People are very interested in having mixed income neighborhoods, and there's some studies that show that people who are growing up in high opportunity neighborhoods end up achieving better outcomes than those who grow up in poorer neighborhoods. How would you respond to that? Do you think that those studies are overhyped? Do you think that mixed income neighborhoods is just an aesthetic preference that isn't really backed by anything?
Well, I am arguing, of course, for wealthy municipalities to have poorer sides of town, which would create a mixed income polity at least, and would allow poorer people to enjoy the public goods, higher quality public goods. So to a certain extent, I'm arguing for that, but I'm not saying that each block and each building should be diverse of incomes. That the Raj Chetty, I forget whether he's back at Harvard, having gone to Stanford. He's one of these superstars that they have bidding wars for at among social scientists. But he's the guy who did this opportunity zone study, and even his study showed that if the kids move when they're older than age 12, they do worse. So how could you possibly have a practical federal program that limits those who get these special high opportunity zone vouchers only to people of a certain age? It's impractical in the extreme. The idea that we should acquiesce in the idea, this shocks me and dismays me, that we should acquiesce in the idea that there are high opportunity zones and low opportunity zones. Why are there low opportunity zones? Because the public goods that we as a society are providing in those places are of low quality. Bad schools, unsafe streets, poor parks, poor recreation. This is not the fault of the residents. This is the fault of the municipalities that are providing these public goods. So I don't think we should acquiesce in the terminology, high opportunity and low opportunity zones.
Do you think that, like, if it was a purely market-based thing, do you think, like, for example, if zoning was just significantly relaxed and next to a single family home, you could have like a small apartment building or something like that, where you could have people living to get in the same neighborhood, but it's all no one's subsidized. It's it's purely market housing. Is that less problematic, do you think? Like, do you think that people will just naturally end up clustering by income, even if there is more of a diversity of housing, even in the same neighborhood?
Well, that's Houston. You have just described the city of Houston, Texas, which does a really good job keeping up with housing demand. And people have deed restrictions and covenants that restrict the kind of housing, but there is a lot more, what looks like spot zoning, commercial and apartment buildings next to smaller residential buildings. Clustering is going to be a fact of life. And this is not my ideological process. This is what the census statisticians find. People cluster on socioeconomic and educational status, particularly. So I think that'll continue to be the norm. But I think if you had less restrictive zoning, you would have more diversity of income. And in pre-zoning areas of the country, not only just Houston, but particularly in older northeastern and midwestern cities, you do see small apartment buildings contiguous typically on main streets to residential areas with single family homes. I think those are nice neighborhoods. They happen to be my aesthetic preference, to use your term.
No, I also think those are nice neighborhoods, for sure. I hope we can produce some more of them. So I want to conclude by talking a little bit about some of our tactics. And you sort of mentioned, a little bit about the SB9 and SB10 in your intro. But in the book, you criticized some of the tactics of the YIMBY movement, where we're kind of racializing the narrative about single family zoning. And personally, I actually mostly agree that it's pretty divisive, and I don't really think that it's the most compelling case in the end anyway. And then on the other hand, when I've argued with other YIMBYs about this, some of them sort of say, well, in the end, if you look at what cities have ended single family zoning recently, you have places like Berkeley and Minneapolis, very progressive cities. Should we take the win? I mean, or is there a better way to be convincing them, given that these are pretty progressive places by and large?
Well, it's a great tactical question. It's similar to your tactical question about, is inclusionary zoning a win because you get more supply? Those are hard questions. I did on the ground interviewing in Minneapolis, and racializing it created so much bitterness that it was hard for me to see it as a positive. By the way, Minneapolis is one of these older cities where they already had, it was not a predominantly single, it was not San Jose. Lots of multifamily apartment buildings and a whole, checkerboard of housing types. It's great. So you got this progressive city council that was brought in because of ranked choice voting. It tipped a couple of key seats, and they were hell-bent to do this and to racialize it, not as a tactic of choice, but because they believe that. And they alienated people who consider themselves to be liberals. And so since the real exclusionary zoning there was in the suburbs, I just think it was going to send a message to the places that really need more relaxed zoning that you guys are racists, and nobody wants to take that on. I don't think it's effective. I could be wrong. Maybe racializing it is going to mow down these barriers, but I saw it get ugly in Minneapolis among people who were not haters. And so that I found that dismaying.
That makes sense. So finally, we've kind of danced around this a little bit, but given the situation that San Francisco is in, with very anti-development governments throughout the Bay Area, but also in San Francisco, we're also pretty anti-development given how big of a city we're trying to be or think we are. We have a housing crisis. We've been dug ourselves into a giant hole since the 70s. We've displaced tons of working class communities out of the city, out of the Oakland, into Richmond and Vallejo and areas where they have to be driving, 60, 80 miles to do the kinds of jobs that can't be done, from home, right? Physical jobs, service type jobs. What kind of policy recommendations would you give for a city like ours? I know. I'll save the hard question for last, huh?
Any development is good development, Are these Google and Facebook company towns going to help?
I think it's pissing in the ocean, sort of, but it's, they'll help, right? I think they'll help to some extent. I think they've been, unfortunately, I think Google and Facebook have been very focused on building housing for everyone, building subsidized housing, and sort of really trying to take it away from we're building housing for people who work, younger tech workers, because those are the demonized people in the political narrative here.
Keyboard industries. I've been taught to call them the keyboard industries.
The keyboard industries. That's pretty funny. I actually haven't heard that before. But there, we are blamed typically for the high cost of housing, which is only a quarter true, right? Which is because, well, sure, yes, people moving here does make housing more expensive if you can't build anymore, right? But that's not what people see, right? People see, new people moving in, new buildings coming in, things getting more expensive, figuring those two things must be causally linked.
Well, I think that, it's like saying, I want the Upper East Side of Manhattan to be a mixed income neighborhood. It's still the wealthiest zip code this side of Beverly Hills. I don't think those things are fundamentally repealable. I think San Francisco is going to remain a very wealthy place and get wealthier because the forces are just converging there. They're unbelievable, So I think the real presenting problem is how to practically connect places where poor people live but need to get to San Francisco in a way that is not onerous, and so do you know this transportation service VIA?
I think I've heard of it.
Yeah, I think it was operating in Oakland a while, but just think of it as Uberizing bus service. I think we have to think very flexibly about private forms of mass transit, not fixed rail. It's so expensive and doesn't go to the right places. Even fixed route buses, I think, are superannuated. I think, in Boston for many years, there was a private bus that took people from the predominantly Chinese part of the city to Chinese restaurants in Maine to work as cooks and took them back home at night.
Wow.
So I would like to see hospitals bringing their employees in, whether it's from Richmond or Vallejo to wherever. I think effective transportation is going to be a much better, approach to jobs housing balance, which is a term I believe in California, than moving the other blocks around.
Yeah. Yeah, we do talk a lot about the jobs housing balance. Okay, well, I think I want to ask. We did cover a lot of the questions that were asked in the chat at some point during the calls, during the talk. So if you think I didn't ask them, please shoot me a message. But I do want to ask a few questions that I don't think we covered. Slums are indeed a market response, but do you think it's necessary that low cost housing be slums and not be subsidized by the public?
Well, I think slums were always in the eye of the beholder. That's one of the points I'm making, is that so-called slum housing wasn't nearly as bad as it was experienced by quote unquote slum dwellers. And there's a terrific book called The Urban Villagers by Herbert Gans, Sociology of 101 textbook. He went and lived in this area of Boston that was about to get demolished for urban renewal because it was a slum. And he found out working class people really liked living there, and they had a different idea of what was a nice place to live. So, there were places that had, privies out back, and that was rough. But I would be much more in favor, to the extent that people are living in garages in South Central LA or East LA. I'd be much more, and they didn't have proper bathrooms. I'd be much more in favor of building public baths to upgrade the slums rather than upgrade every housing unit. And that used to be the approach. And, in the third world, they're struggling with that kind of idea. South Africa's doing that kind of thing. The favelas in Brazil. I don't think it's either or, where you either have to have a subsidized unit or slums that are shock the conscience.
Yeah, in some ways, I sort of think of it like this, a little bit like the sweatshop discourse, where it's like, sweatshops are terrible. All these people in third world countries, there's 12-year-olds working, and like, sure, I get there are standards that might be very bad, but like the alternative might be these people are no jobs and are in deep, deep, desperate poverty.
That is, it's a Hobbesian choice and a Faustian bargain, to mix all my metaphors.
So the last question I had, and I think you sort of covered it, but did banning slums and only allowing subsidized low-income housing lead to our country's explosion in homelessness? Would it have been better to leave slums legal and then give public dollars to retrofit or improve them?
Well, the answer, I think, is yes, but I think the homelessness thing is all about mental hospital deinstitutionalization. In 1955, there were 55,000 state psychiatric beds in the state of California. Today, there are 5,000. And there's 50,000 homeless people on the street, at least. Now, we don't need as many as we needed then. There were syphilitic elderly people living in mental hospitals. That's don't need that anymore. But when you have paranoid schizophrenic people, they need care. They're homeless because they think they're God, and they're living on the street being God. I mean, this is the ultimate lack of compassion and government failure. And I think it's only tangentially related to housing. Now, some people who were extremely low end working class used to live in single room occupancy hotels, and we did destroy those. And that is a market niche that was unfortunately demolished. And we could have improved those by having shared kitchens. And there's a lot of models for very low working class incomes to have housing that is not subsidized, but it would have to have, a different model of housing.
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny. There is a new SRO proposal that we are advocating for in San Francisco, and I think it's mostly, if not all, market rate, or at least, I mean, it's like they're like market rate or mostly market rate SROs, and like the progressives in San Francisco are organizing against it, of course, because they're against anything that's built at market rate.
Yeah, but I think you can really. San Diego a while ago was trying to do that, and you need. Like, you can't have full-on baths and kitchens, there are ways to do it, but you have to compromise.
Right. Yeah. And I think on the homeless side, I think there's, I always say that there's sort of two homeless crises in San Francisco. There's the mental illness, and there's the people that are largely on the street who have drug problems, mental illness, often both. And then there's also people who are like kind of more invisible homeless people who are like sleeping in their cars or RVs, who are, many of those people are actually just poor, right? And they can't afford to pay for rent. And those aren't the people that actually, you don't notice them as homeless, because obviously if you are sleeping in your car, you don't want anyone to know you're sleeping in your car. So you probably take a lot of pains to, shower and make sure you're not looking like you're visibly homeless, because most people don't want to look like they're visibly homeless.
Right. What I object to is the fact that subsidized housing activists invoke the tent encampment homeless for their cause, whereas the tent encampment homeless have a whole different set of issues that we need to attend to, and not build $750,000 low-income housing tax credit units and say that we're going to help them.
Yeah, no, I agree. Those people, yeah, it's not, you can't, most of them are not going to be helped by purely providing housing. All right. Well, I don't think they're.
Can you save this? Can you save the chat for me so I can read all these at my leisure?
I think I can. Well, I can just copy it right now, and read it and send it to you.
There's you can click three dots and then click save chat.
Oh, really?
I saved it. Yeah.
Oh, you saved it. Okay, thanks, Stephen.
If you guys can't figure that out, then I'm really shocked.
No, I think I think Stephen's got it. So we will send you the questions. I do, and all the chat. I think it was interesting. A lot of people had some of the similar. You brought up some of the same topics that we talked about in our conversation. I really, this was really a great conversation. I'm super glad that you could take some time out of your evening, which is kind of late for you, to take some time and spend with us. I think I certainly found it very informative, and I hope everyone else did too. I sent over the link to purchase the book earlier, and I will just post it one more time in the chat if you want to get a little bit of a discount off of Amazon.
It's an independent bookstore, right?
I think so. Yeah, it's an independent bookstore, and it's a good book. And as I said, it's a quick read, so I would encourage everyone to to just give it a chance and see what you think.
It's really nice of you, Jeremy. I'm so happy to have done this, and I'm so encouraged that you guys are out there doing what you're doing. So do keep it up.
Thank you.